Hey there, hi there, ho there, good morning, everybody, or afternoon or evening, wherever you're beaming in from. It's great to see you all out there. Just a reminder, this is a live chat, a live event, so put your comments in the chat, ask your questions, give us your positive encouragement. This is the Inner Drone Drones at Dawn podcast. We are on episode 12, and we are knee deep in Safety and Security Month. And this topic that we're going to talk about today actually hits both safety and security. And I'm kind of calling this the good, the bad, and the beautiful about drone swarms. And we're going to get into drone swarms and cybersecurity both today. So hopefully you guys got your cup of joe and you're ready to roll. So anyway, without further ado, I'd love to introduce to you my two amazing guests. I have with us here today Tim Haynie from Spectrobotics. You can see he's a fellow Coloradan. He's got the flag up, showing the flag literally there in the background. And also Gary Korn. Gary has many, many hats. He is here. He has a consulting firm, which you just saw, Juice Novus, and he's also a professor of law and runs the Washington School of Law's Law, Technology, and National Security, if I said that correct, Law, Technology, and Security Institute. Gary, correct. Okay, yeah, he was like leaning forward like you're saying it wrong. So let's go ahead and jump right in. Tim, let's start with you and go ahead and tell us a little bit about yourself and about Spectrabotics.
Oh, my favorite topic. Thank you so much. So I'm Tim Haynie. I'm the CEO and founder of Spectrobotics here in Colorado Springs, Colorado. And we are a deep learning data analytics company that focuses on smart city and smart agriculture applications for all the disparate data that's being collected to solve these problems. So, we got kind of revved up and interested in the drone world back, about 2015, when commercially it really started taking off and the platforms were getting a lot more reliable than they were in the beginning. And so we saw them as a tremendous opportunity to put the right sensor, the right use case for this type of technology. And then, immediately started running into problems on how to make the most out of that data that gets collected. So we have, as a company, been focused on the analytics side of what drones can do. So let's take the sensor data we get, let's take advantage of the timeliness that drones provide, and let's turn that into something actionable for precision ag, for smart city, for smart infrastructure, oil and gas, and then as recently helping the DoD. So there's we'll talk about that a little bit more.
Yeah, I mean, the analytics you're bringing to bear are relevant to drone swarms. And like you said, Tim, we'll talk about that here in a second. But what inspired you to create Spectrabotics?
I have a love for all things technical, and when I got out of the military after retiring, I did 20 years as an Army engineer and then as an Army space officer, actually. So the experience I had working with technology that we have in space, with satellites and communication and GPS and all the hardware we're familiar with, realized that there was a market for that in the commercial sector, especially for the analytics on the data that's collected. So imagine a satellite at 400 kilometers collecting imagery over an area. Now I can do that at 400 feet. And just the amazing resolution and the timeliness, for being able to collect when we want, where we want, and put the right sensor on there, just really hit a lot of areas of interest of mine and really saw a problem that needed to be solved, which was we don't have the software, we don't have the tools to necessarily get what we want from drones at the time, because everything was built for space. So that's where we started bending some metal and started hiring some really talented developers, and let's figure out how to solve this the right way, and been there ever since. So, just there's adventure, there's discovery, there's all this amazing stuff that happens when you start to fuse data together and start to really get after it with some cutting edge decision science tools.
And I love your motto, from precision to decision. And it's really relevant to what you just said, Tim, and to this idea of drone swarms. And I know you're doing some research right now in this area. So can you tell us a little bit about what you're doing?
So absolutely. The DoD obviously is interested in swarms, but our focus actually is not on the swarm itself, but on the sensors. So imagine you've got this very unique sensor, and part of the joy of this job is I get to work with great companies and great personalities and great thought leaders in this space. But we finally got our hands on this hyperspectral sensor that says, hey, in a very fast process, I can find items of interest. I can really lock in on what it is I'm looking for and be very specific about what we're searching for. So, that's sort of led us to believe, hey, there's an opportunity here for this to be sort of a kickoff moment. So now we've got high fidelity on a problem, but we don't have all the sensors all the time in all the places. So we're going to need to be able to bring in other resources and assets to help illuminate the problem or help gather collection on this. But it's hard, it's hard. One person, one drone, one camera, one flight is expensive and untimely and doesn't work well. But if we could automate all of this and then allow the sensors to inform the decision-making process on what we send where, now all of a sudden we've got some opportunities where we can have one operator, 10 systems, 10 sensors, lots more coverage without, adding the burden of having to fly them all and having to coordinate what they do.
You and I had talked earlier about this idea of swarms for good. And I think this is a perfect example. You and I talked about, for example, a hazmat spill scenario. Can you walk us through, a drone swarm and these various sensors that could be employed and how the technology and the analytics that you're bringing to bear on this problem can really help solve the information issue that an incident and an on-scene commander would have? Right.
So the impetus behind this actually came from the Air Force. The Air Force says, we've got a lot of base defense missions that we're concerned about. Hazmat is certainly one of them. And the Air Force has really figured out how to tap into companies like mine. Like, I have a DoD background, but I didn't have a DoD focus for what we were doing. We were smart cities, smart ag kind of markets. But really incentivized us to get involved with DoD and try and bring some of our technology to address DoD concerns. So then they put out, the question, hey, who's got technology that can affect hazmat or search and rescue or, humanitarian assistance and disaster response? And then certainly the drone is like the ideal platform to rapidly respond to something like this. But now we're back to the same problem. We've got one sensor on it. We've only got one drone, one operator. We've got to really broaden the collection capability of something that's, kind of smallish by design and somewhat limited. So we've got to maximize all of this. So, we said, hey, we've got access to the sensor companies that build these amazing new data collection services. Let's marry that with drone platforms that are responsive and flexible, and we can program them to do what we want. And then let's go after problems like humanitarian assistance and disaster response, where things like mapping hazmat spillage locations, that requires several different sensors to be working in coordination with each other to do it effectively and rapidly. Let's go after search and rescue, or we've had a natural disaster and we're looking for, people who are hurt or missing. In order to broaden the range and to speed up that decision process, it's going to require a lot more assets than we're accustomed to working with. So, now we finally get a real meaty problem to go solve, which is how do we coordinate all these platforms and assets to work as a single unit? And that single unit is designed to, focus on a problem, the problem being a spillage or a lost hiker or a downed pilot, or any kind of base defense type application or civil response. And that's otherwise it gets really expensive. If you have to utilize satellite imagery, that's probably not very responsive. If you have to use aircraft for something, then it's going to get costly and it's going to put people's lives at risk. So we see this as a great opportunity to kind of bring some interesting hardware and technology, couple that with sensors and couple that with data analytics and give it a real good humanitarian, flavor to it. It's a great way to build the technology really quickly.
I love that. A lot of people talk about drones for good. I know there's a hashtag on that. I think I'm going to create a new one, swarms for good, right? Because
swarms for absolutely.
Swarm for good. Let's do it.
Yeah, there's we have a built-in sort of negative connotation on swarms because you immediately think of bees or wasps or something that's hurtful.
Something that's going to sting you.
Absolutely. Who wants that?
Yeah, exactly. But on the other hand, right, we all know that any technology that can be used for good can also potentially have a dark side. So since we're talking about not only just safety, which I think you just really pinged on there, Tim, using drones in support of different safety and humanitarian missions. The flip side of that, the security risk that comes with these highly advanced systems that, as you said, talk to each other autonomously, can laser pinpoint a particular target. Tell us a little bit about the security aspects that this technology brings to life.
Yeah, most of the architectures we work with are open. It's open source. It is commercial hardware. So there are many areas of vulnerabilities that exist when you're trying to build technology like this, and keeping it secure is it's not an afterthought, but it's not your first thought. Your first thought is, hey, keep these things in the air for as long as possible and have them not go off and hit things and cause other problems out there. So, we're to the point where now security is the concern. How do we prevent people from getting inside of it and making it go do something else or shutting it down? And there's lots of research out there on how to do that. And there's lots of other research that says, hey, we're going to get inside and start controlling it to do something we want it to do. So hardening these systems, especially when you come from a commercial world, it's sort of new tech that has to be introduced, and new thinking and new concepts that prevent them from, straying off course or doing something else. So it's going to take another set of skills to harden these and make them, respond only to us and only in the way we want them to, and prevent, others from being able to get inside of it. And that's I don't pretend to know all the answers on how to do that, because part of the challenge is it's a drone. So you can't, start adding in lots of hardware and, and fancy communication systems like that. It gets too big and bulky and shortens the flight time. So now we've got to get real clever in the software and get really clever in the techniques we use to harden these.
And speaking of clever, good segue over to Gary. I'm going to go slightly off script and out of order based on what we talked about, but Tim just kind of opened the discussion to this idea of cybersecurity. And, we don't tend to give lengthy bios on this program, so I'd encourage you to check out Tim's website, to check out Gary's various websites. But I want to brag on Gary for a second. He was the U.S. Cyber Command staff judge advocate or head lawyer before he retired as a colonel in the Army. By the way, both Tim and Gary had wonderful careers in the United States Army. And in fact, Gary is the one that introduced me to Tim, so small world. So Gary, let's talk about cybersecurity. I know there's buzz about SolarWinds, and clearly SolarWinds was not a drone issue. SolarWinds was a supply chain, raises supply chain issues and concerns in cyber hardware, as Tim was just alluding to, the need for better hardware and software. Can you tell us a little bit about that? And, you just did a great panel at Duke Law. If you all have not seen it, check out Duke Law Ethics National Security website. They have a thing called Lawfare blog. And Gary's panel is up there. But Gary, fire away on these cybersecurity concerns, drone swarms and otherwise.
Yeah, thanks. And thanks for having me here this morning, Dawn. It's always good to be back with you. And of course, back with Tim. We were sort of partners in crime for a little bit in the Army and running around Fort Lewis and Japan and doing some other things. So always good to see him. The cybersecurity aspects, there's just so many different angles to this. It's really challenging. On the one hand, I'm looking at my good friend running this company, and I'm just thinking of all the different risks just as a company that he has to think through and manage by the collection and aggregation of data. Data is everything, right? I mean, it's just the coin of the realm for everyone. It is information, it is power, and everybody wants to grab it illicitly, if not, legitimately. So, and yeah, SolarWinds was a software supply chain issue. Lots of the components, if not the drones themselves, some would argue, come with inherent security problems because of where the market dominance is in the production of drones and small UAVs, right? So we've talked about this elsewhere. Varying views and information coming out, but certainly there are, I'd say, legitimate concerns about the nature of the Chinese government's interests and its relationship to the manufacturers of many of these drone capabilities. So you can have, hardware supply chain issues, cyber vulnerabilities that are baked right into the hardware and operating systems of different capabilities. You can also just have standard cybersecurity risks with the software you're using to run your capabilities. When you start moving into the swarm discussion, this can, like everything else, it's a capability that can be used for good. Drones themselves have a negative connotation because of the way the conversations have evolved over time. It's, to me, it's sort of ridiculous. Well, let's have the same conversation about a helicopter, which is a larger manned platform to do a lot of the same things that you can achieve more efficiently, more effectively, with greater loiter time, et cetera, with drone capabilities, right? You can use them for search and rescue, which I think everybody would agree is a net positive. You can use them as a means and method of warfare, right? It runs the spectrum. But for this, the swarm capability now, you're looking at taking what we've been evolving as an effective tool for data collection, surveillance, reconnaissance, and even some other, more offensive things in the military, but to scale it now, right? To scale that capability with massed, synchronized use of multiple drones. That takes a higher echelon level of artificial intelligence, automation. To do that, it's all algorithm driven, like so many things, and algorithms themselves are vulnerable, right, to being hacked, to being manipulated. So there's just a ton of security concerns about it. That shouldn't stop us from pushing forward and developing and using this. But it's something to think about. There's on the side of protecting the data that you're collecting for legitimate purposes. There's certainly, if you look at like Clearview AI's capability, that circumstance, there's anytime you're collecting and aggregating data at scale, there's also risks of misuse of that data, right? And then there's the external risk factor of the data falling into the hands of the wrong actors, i.e. our adversaries, and protecting against that, and then how they could use that against us. There's just a whole spectrum here.
Oh my gosh, so much there to unpack. We're definitely not going to have enough time, but let's back up for a second and just talk Hollywood, because why not? It's a Monday morning and we all have coffee. So we were talking before we went live that in 2019, there was that movie with Gerard Butler called Angel Has Fallen. For those that haven't watched it, pretty good flick, but there's one scene with the drone swarm where Gerard Butler is the head of a secret security detail, and he's on a boat, I think on the Chesapeake, somewhere on a river, with the president of the United States, played by Morgan Freeman. All of a sudden you hear the loud humming noise coming from above, and this drone swarm appears out of nowhere, blows up basically the entire security detail, the entire Secret Service right there. And of course, as would be the case in Hollywood, Butler grabs Morgan Freeman, they jump overboard into the river, and everybody lives, at least those two do. Interestingly enough, the articles at the time written about that movie talked about how this could happen maybe someday, but the technology, quote, isn't there yet. That was only 2 years ago. Tim, are we there yet?
Absolutely, we're there. But I don't want to make it sound trivial or easy. It is extremely difficult. And there are a couple of key areas of development where we started pushing and testing, one of them being, control between a sensor and the flight control, and then there has to be another layer of software that's looking at pattern of life to figure out, okay, which of these options is makes the most sense, based on how I've been programmed. None of that is trivial. And while it's, anybody can put, an explosive device on a commercial drone and send it from point A to point B, that's not very challenging. There are lots of ways to defeat something like that. And so, adversaries are getting really clever on how they work around some of these vulnerabilities that exist in drones. And it is an ever-present concern, I think. I wouldn't put it as like everybody can do it, but I certainly know that there's a lot of study going on in this area of automation. And just like Gary mentioned, being able to scale, the command and control of things like this, there's a lot of research in that area. That said, I'm not too concerned about it at the moment because I know how challenging it can be. But it won't be long before now we've got to come up with some defeat systems to counter the threat.
And when we were talking one drone, that's one thing. When you're talking multiple drones, you've just multiplied the issue. And Gary, you mentioned this idea of foreign drones and some of the cyber security and vulnerability concerns there. You've written about this most recently on the Lawfare blog. Lawfire, two different things. The Lawfare blog. So if you all haven't checked that out, definitely read that piece. Gary talks about the law that applies in these scenarios, but could you just kind of walk us through just very briefly, again, relevant, because if we're talking Chinese drones, and we are, let's be frank, it's one thing to have one, it's another thing to have a whole group that are now talking to each other and synchronized, given some of the things that you've written about and some of the concerns that could be there.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a little bit sort of different conversations. One is, the conversation that's been going on is the concern about the data that is sort of collected by average users using drones manufactured in China, and whether China can easily access that data, leverage it, scale it, et cetera. And so it's certainly of a sufficient concern that the federal government has basically kind of banned or moved off of using Chinese manufactured drones. There's not a broad ban at this point for Joe Q public, like buying and using them. Although, side note, my wife may have gotten me one for my birthday, at which point I said, let's return that. I'll look at a different option. But right, that's different than the Chinese developing themselves the capability to use drones at scale and swarm. Like they would control theirs. There's arguably some overlap. I think Tim alluded to this, whether the ability or not of China to access the control software for the drones that are produced and sort of take them over at scale and create a drone bot army or something, or Air Force. I mean, I think that's really, really hard. And I think that's probably that. I don't see that concern percolating up right now, but it doesn't mean that they don't have the ability to produce in mass their own drones that they do control and they can use in a swarm capability. And DoD is absolutely focused in on this, and they're worried about it. This could be a real challenge. And they've been struggling. The department's been struggling to develop sort of authorities to figure out how to deal with drone threats not at scale. And in order to be able to deal with this problem at scale, there's going to have to be automated responses, right? And so it's just in a cycle of thinking through what's the right framework, what are the right authorities, how would you be able to defeat a swarm? And it's a range. It's anything, from kinetic means, which is probably not all that realistic. Shooting down a mass flock of drones isn't going to happen. So are there electromagnetic spectrum options that might be more effective? Are there the ability to hack into those, their systems through cyber means? And are there ways to manipulate the algorithms they're using to turn them back on themselves or render them inert or whatever? They're looking at all these different options.
Yeah, they're looking at them literally as we speak, because the Navy's doing an exercise right now off the coast of California on basically the joint command and control of all different unmanned systems. And I believe counter UAS is a piece of that. In fact, last summer, I know we kind of, the three of us talked about this. We still don't have the final answer on who was swarming around some Navy ships, but it was happening and they were taking pictures of the drones. So that recently broke and through a FOIA request, and we don't have final answers. Maybe we never will on what exactly happened there. But this idea of counter UAS authorities, very significant, only because the DoD, DOE, DHS, and including the Coast Guard, and who am I missing, Gary? Very limited number of groups have authorities to actually do counter UAS.
Well, certainly domestically, right?
What's that?
Certainly domestically.
Domestically. Doing something here in the homeland is much different than doing it on the battlefield. I think the three of us, of all people, can really appreciate that. And that's the challenge and the different authorities that are here. So absolutely. Let's pivot a little bit to the software issue, Gary, the SolarWinds issue, and this idea again that it didn't relate to drones, but at the end of the day, it could, only because there were vulnerabilities injected into the software for updates that went unnoticed for a very long time by a very large number of people. Tell us a little bit about that. That was Russia, by the way, not China, as far as we know. So can you tell us a little bit about that, Gary?
Well, sure. I mean, this is not, you see in the sanctions that were just announced, the executive order, it was very much SolarWinds focused, although not limited to SolarWinds. It spoke to a whole host of, let's just say, unacceptable behavior by Russia from our perspective. And sort of corrupting and riding supply chains is not an unusual tactic or technique for the Russians. So, and that's exacerbated here because they very much understand that because of our legal system and our architecture, the government doesn't have broad surveillance over what's happening on domestic networks. And arguably, that's the right answer, but it creates an information gap that is something that can be exploited generally. So they hacked into SolarWinds, into its Orion platform, which is basically broadly an IT management software capability that numerous companies, even government agencies and organizations use with a trust framework, right? Because you're purchasing this software from a vendor, you have a trust relationship, and its updates, ride right through any perimeter security you might have from a cyber perspective. And they took full advantage of that. So now they're just riding inserting malware undetected, and gaining footholds where they can then maneuver internally, laterally across networks. And it was a very broad-based access operation that they then leveraged, to the best we can see right now, to kind of neck down to better collection opportunities. So, and
key, right, was that this was primarily against private industry. And to the point of someone in the chat, I'm sorry, I cannot read your handle there. Somebody says here, countering drones and drone swarms is also extremely important to the states for corrections and for stadium and crowd protection. The way I'm connecting Gary's thought and that thought are the fact that SolarWinds was against private industry. And oh, by the way, 90% of critical infrastructure, which includes stadiums and prisons, is owned privately. Yeah. And so, yeah.
So private industry, but in the sense that, I think ultimately the SVR's focal point was gaining access to a smaller number, actually collecting from a smaller number of targets. But it doesn't matter. I mean, the point is everything's interconnected, and, 90+% of cyber infrastructure and backbone runs on the private sector. So yes, it's all vulnerable. And using supply chain operations, you could also gain access to whatever systems might be used to control drones, even for good, legit purposes in a, for swarms and however, and, interrupt those operations, leverage those operations, siphon off the data from those operations, which itself, I mean, just think about the amount of stuff that you're collecting, Tim, that could potentially be relevant to an adversary, right? I mean, it's important for the operations you're trying to help and support. It's important to farmers. It's important to local and state governments. It could also be a rich soup of information for an adversary to try and get involved, get into, and extract.
To your point, Gary, one of the things I love about my job and love about Colorado in general is we have access to manufacturers for these, drone command and control platforms, so we're not reliant on, foreign markets to build the technology we need. We can build it all here in-house, and we can trust the supply chains as much as you can. And then we directly interface with the people who design and build and code and test and sell these things. So, having local access to technology like this, in this drone space, gives us some confidence that that we can continue building and continue proving the technology with being able to trust where the hardware comes from. So it's not like we're reliant on anybody that creates these vulnerabilities for us. We actually have figured out how to resource this ourselves in such a way that we can trust it.
And to your point, Tim, the Department of Defense, obviously through the Defense Innovation Unit, working with the Army, actually created the Blue SUAS program. There's 5 companies now that are certified, and trusted, and to be on the GSA list for federal agencies, but of course, with a DoD focus. I just saw there's a trusted capital effort going on for venture capitalists.
Right.
So you see the theme here, right? Which is, how do we trust things? Where is either the money, the software, the hardware, where is it coming from, and why should we care? By the way, everybody out there, if you haven't checked out the 2021 Office of the Director of National Intelligence Threat Assessment, it just hit the streets about a week ago. So you might want to check that out, the different countries that it lists and different concerns. And, all of them at some point many of them can link back to this issue of drones, whether swarms, whether individual drones. And so, absolutely check that out. Well, we're running short on time, and we could talk all day long. Every single one of these issues merits probably a session onto itself, for which unfortunately we don't have time. So I want to give each of you just a couple minutes to sum up, to maybe end on a high note. What's the beauty of drone swarms as you see it, Tim, and the work that you're doing? How is it going to elevate the industry?
Great question, Dawn. Thank you. The, drones have a limited capability in that they're very small and can only handle so much weight, for the missions that they're designed to do. The only way we can overcome that is to bring in more systems, and be a little bit more diverse in what we hang on them, and then be a little more creative in how we approach scaling the command and control of them. The field is wide open, and there are so many great ideas out there floating around on how to do this. And there's this robust community of people that are just naturally drawn into robotics and automated systems and artificial intelligence and deep learning. There's this groundswell, this movement, if you will, of resources guys like us can tap into to say, hey, come here and solve this problem for us so that we can apply this to a direct market need. And that I think is what's really driving this innovation. Is there is a tremendous market need in smart city and smart agriculture and smart infrastructure and oil and gas, to take advantage of what drones bring, this timeliness and this ultra high resolution, and and the ability to solve very complex environmental problems, because we have this deluge of data to sort through. So, having those resources available to us is what's really accelerating the development of this. And we're just super excited to be in this space. There's so much room to grow and so many great projects for us to really focus in on.
And to quote, from the Spider-Man comic book and movies, with great power comes great responsibility. And with all this technology, it's just job security for lawyers like Gary. And I love having, Tim as the scientist slash engineer slash drone. Can I say geek? Is that okay, Tim?
Nerd.
Drone geek.
Nerd.
Nerd with Gary together, because that nexus, that these communications are so important. The technology can never advance without having the right authorities in place. So Gary, what do you want to tell the crowd before we sign off here?
So it's interesting. I mean, on the one hand, we ran a project at my program a little over a year ago, spurred on by a lot of the events that happened, after George Floyd, was killed, right? We're seeing the trial now. And how can technology actually be used as a means for improving policing, for improving, equal justice, et cetera? Because the general framework is always technology is bad. Technology is going to be abused, right? And it was hard to find people to actually come in and offer perspectives where technology could be helpful. And it can, right? And then we saw kind of a flip and a reverse. Technology has been a key component of identifying lots of the miscreants who assaulted the Capitol on January 6th. Right? And so now it's sort of your perspective. Who is it being used for or against, right? But I would say this, there's absolutely significant legal, ethical, and moral questions that get raised by all these emerging technologies that we really have to think through. The problem is they're evolving faster than we can think about it. And we can't hit a pause button to be able to let the thinking keep pace with the evolution of this stuff, because unfortunately there's a real pressure. Our adversaries don't care about legal, ethical, and moral issues. And we're in a race oftentimes on a lot of this stuff, right? And we can't lose that edge either, because it could be detrimental from a national security perspective. So there's a real tension and difficulty there. I can't say how to solve that, but we got to figure it out and try and run as fast as we can to think ethically, morally, and legally about how we're developing this stuff.
I love that, Gary. Think faster. That's what we need to be doing, at least on the legal and policy side, as you say. And I'm glad you're part of that effort, Gary. I'm privileged to be a part of that as well. And Tim, thank you for what you're doing, and the Swarms for Good project. It's my new hashtag. I love it. You're doing amazing things. And Gary, to your point, I totally agree. There are so many drones for good, swarms for good, technology for good stories that just don't make the cut, in the newsroom floor, because you know what? It's not cool enough. It's not sexy enough. And those are the things that are making a difference every day in people's lives. So let's keep those coming. And ending on the note of that drone swarms can be beautiful. So, all right, everybody. Thank you, Gary. Thank you, Tim. Thank you, everybody out there. Mark, thanks for your comment about stadiums and corrections facilities. That was awesome. Please join us next week. It will be, looking at the calendar there, our last week for our Drone Safety and Security Month. We have with us Major General retired Fred Rogero from Resilient Solutions, who's going to talk to us about safety management systems and round out the month. Looking ahead, we are going to focus on global drone regulations in the month of May. So that should be really exciting. And oh, by the way, 2 other notes before we sign off. Number one is check out my Patreon page. I'm posting up bonus footage of these 2 guys, as well as ad-free content, and my Deliberations by Dawn blog, which I post up a couple times a week. And secondarily, starting a Clubhouse. So if you have an iPhone, get on Clubhouse, join us. We just started, I started with Maggie Schuster and Nettie Davis, a room called Drone Law Connections. And it's going to dovetail with this podcast. And we're going to kick it off next Thursday, the 29th, with Canadian drone regulations, to get you real excited to come back to our podcast the following Monday. So anyway, great to see you all. Thanks for joining in, everybody. Take care. Have a great week out here.